Andrew is also a graduate of the University of New South Wales, where he completed a Bachelor of Arts, majoring in history and philosophy. In 2015, Andrew, he was elected to the federal seats of Canning in Western Australia, and he's been a member of the Joint Standing Committee of Foreign Affairs, Defence, Trade, and he sits on various other subcommittees and specialised defence and human rights. Now, it's my great pleasure to welcome Andrew Hastie. So, Andrew, it's over to you.
Thanks very much, Fritz, and good evening to everyone over in Sydney and elsewhere. It's really good to be with you. I'm sorry about the sun. I'm looking into a western sunset. The Indian Ocean isn't far from here, so we're a couple of hours behind. And I grew up in Sydney, but I do love the West, and the sunsets is one of the reasons why this is now my home. But thanks to Walter, Sean, Natasha, and good evening to my parliamentary colleague, Jim, as well. It's good to have you on the call. Fritz said I'm going to paint a vision for Australia for the 21st century. It's probably not going to be that comprehensive, but I will give you some reflections on I think what we do need to think about if we're going to be a competitive country in the 21st century. The situation's constantly changing, and we're in the 9th month of this year, and no one anticipated that we would be in this position even back in January. It's been a remarkable year, and a historic hinge, if you want to call it that, in the same way 9/11 was, in the same way the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 was. 2020 will be a year remembered as a great year of disruption, huge disruption to economies around the world, political systems around the world. And it's not yet over. We've still got the presidential election in 50 days. So there'll be more surprises, I imagine, yet to unfold. But nonetheless, we need to be a competitive Australian. That's my big idea for tonight, a competitive Australia. The Prime Minister, when he gave his speech at the Australian Defence Force Academy a couple of months ago, where he updated the country on our defence strategic update, said that the world post-pandemic is going to be more dangerous, more disorderly, and poorer. And as we emerge from the economic wreckage of COVID-19, the political and geopolitical disruption of COVID-19, we need to be a country that is sovereign and competitive. And there's lots of opportunities there, but I think we need to move out of a defensive crouch, and we need to start thinking about ways that we can ensure our sovereignty, ensure our resilience, and essentially make us more competitive in a really tough strategic environment. That means not just competitive in a security sense, but also in an economic sense. And we need to leverage every advantage that we can possibly get. The document I'm referring to you tonight is this one, which you can see. Please get a copy of this. The Defence Strategic Update. This is really essential reading. It's very clear, and it updates the 2016 Defence White Paper. Last year, I wrote an op-ed for the Sydney Morning Herald, which attracted a fair bit of attention at the time, where I argued that every single strategic question for Australia going forward would be refracted through the geopolitical competition between the United States and the People's Republic of China. And I located the origins of that competition back in 2001, on April Fool's Day, in fact, when a US spy plane came into contact with a PRC fighter jet over the South China Sea, was forced to land on Hainan Island. The crew was taken into custody by the PRC. The plane was stripped and plundered for intelligence, and then sent back to the US sometime later in the back of a Russian Antonov cargo plane. And I argued that that was a more seminal moment, a more important moment potentially than 9/11 was. 9/11 happened, of course, 5 months later, but April Fool's Day 2001 was very significant because it was the first time we saw some real strategic competition between the United States and China. And now, of course, the South China Sea is something of a contested space. And here we are in 2020 with COVID-19 as the backdrop, trying to acquaint ourselves with the new reality. It is very confusing. There's a lot happening. There's a lot changing. I don't propose to have all the answers, but I think the first thing we need to do as a country is actually understand our strategic environment. And that's why I'm pointing you directly to this document, because I think it articulates some of the challenges that we have ahead of us. Once we understand the environment, then we can start making the necessary changes to our security posture and our architecture, our capabilities, and also that of our economy. And the economy is absolutely critical. If we are going to spend more on defense, for example, then obviously we need a strong economy to fund that. Without that, we're not in a position to secure ourselves for the next 20 to 30 years. So those things are woven together. I reject the argument that somehow the national security questions are exclusive to the economic ones. They're both woven tightly together. And so people on both sides of the debate, you know, people who are regarded as hawks, who exclude economic questions, are wrong. And those who are focused solely on economic prosperity to the exclusion of security questions are also wrong. We need to see these things as intimately linked and critical to our sovereignty. So just a little bit more about some of the things that are driving our future direction. As I mentioned, the strategic competition between the United States and China, and this update says, will be the principal driver of strategic dynamics in our region. It says this competition is playing out across the Indo-Pacific and increasingly in our immediate region, the area ranging from the northeastern Indian Ocean through maritime and mainland Southeast Asia, through to Papua New Guinea and the Southwest Pacific. So right across the top of our continent. Very, very important that we understand the challenge. The second driver is that major powers have become more assertive. We're seeing countries assert themselves more and more throughout the region. Don't take it from me, take it from the Defence Strategic Update. It says precisely, major powers have become more assertive in advancing their strategic preferences and seeking to exert influence, including China's active pursuit of greater influence in the Indo-Pacific. So this Defence Strategic Update names China. We're not talking about great powers, we're talking about China. And it goes on to say, Australia is concerned by the potential for actions such as the establishment of military bases, which could undermine stability in the Indo-Pacific and our immediate region. We don't need to look any further than the South China Sea, where the People's Republic of China, using very sophisticated dredging techniques, have essentially built unsinkable aircraft carriers in the South China Sea from what were atolls, not islands, but atolls. And now they have military capabilities on those islands. And of course, a lot of our trade passes through the South China Sea. So it's not just Australia who is exposed, but a number of countries whose trade makes passage through the South China Sea, which is why freedom of navigation operations are so incredibly important. But how do major powers become more assertive? They pursue their strategic interests through a combination of coercive activities, including espionage, interference, and economic levers. This is a really important point. Authoritarian powers, non-democratic powers, have a culture of subversion, strategic subversion, which I argue comes out of their Marxist-Leninist ideology or worldview. And they don't see a difference between war and peace the way that we do. We see war and peace as two distinct spheres. Traditional Marxist-Leninist ideology thinks about life as one ongoing struggle. We draw out a lot of our strategic thinking from the ideas of Karl von Clausewitz, the Prussian military officer and writer. He wrote On War before dying in 1830. He's famous for the dictum, war is the continuation of politics by other means. Marxist-Leninists would say, politics is the continuation of war by other means. So every tool of statecraft is a way of advancing their interests, and that's where we start talking about coercive activities. They could be considered a form of warfare in a sense, not in the sense that we think about it, and that's part of the problem. So espionage, interference, and economic levers, and then we talk about grey zone activities. Acts of statecraft being conducted up to the point of war, using paramilitary forces, using cyber attacks, a whole number of ways that challenge countries' sovereignty and also puts pressure on the international system. So these are some significant threats, not just for us, but other countries throughout the region. The Russians are very good at this, of course. They have a strong culture of strategic subversion. The People's Republic of China do as well. And, in order to be a competitive Australia, we need to maintain and uphold our sovereignty. And so what we've actually been doing as a government over the last 3 or 4 years, I think, has been recovering our sovereignty and strengthening our sovereignty. I think we're actually leading other Western democracies in some of the reforms that we've taken in the national security sector. When you consider some of the European countries who I engage with, or at least their legislators through the International Parliamentary Coalition on China, they're a long way behind on what we've done. And just to give you a brief overview, in 2017, for example, we declined to ratify the China extradition treaty. In 2018, we passed the espionage and foreign interference laws. In 2018, we excluded ZTE and Huawei from our future 5G network, which was a critical decision. Sovereignty isn't just a territorial problem, it's also a digital problem. And if you can't protect and preserve your data, you're not sovereign. And so having a network, a future 5G network, which will power our future economy that is secure, is critical to our digital sovereignty. Last year, we funded to the tune of $90 million the Espionage and Foreign Interference Task Force, which is an organisation that's a fusion of ASIO and AFP elements. They've been at work this year. You'll have seen some of their operations reported in the media. And then just this year, the federal government, again, is taking steps to ensure our sovereignty is preserved through the Foreign Relations Bill, which hasn't yet been put into the House. But nonetheless, when it does come, it's designed to make sure that dud deals entered into by local governments, state governments, or universities can be annulled by the foreign minister if they are contrary to the national interest. And I would say that the Victorian government's BRI deal is contrary to the national interest. So we'll be watching that very closely. But nonetheless, the BRI, again, we shouldn't consider that some sort of economic arrangement or a financial arrangement. It's a strategic arrangement, and that's a very different sort of thing. Strategic arrangements are, there are strings attached when you enter into them, and there's a reason why many of the countries that have signed up to the Belt and Road Initiative are also some of the world's weakest creditor nations. And of course, if you can't pay down your debts, you forfeit critical infrastructure. That's what happened with the port of Hambantota in Sri Lanka. The Sri Lankan government was unable to pay down its debt on the port, and that is now an asset of the Chinese government. So we've done a number of things over the last few years, and they're all very important. And I think they build a framework for us to think about how we grow as a country economically. But unless you have those things in place, unless you're protecting your intellectual property, unless you're keeping your big businesses safe from economic espionage, unless you're keeping your political institutions preserved and their integrity upheld from interference, then your sovereignty is compromised. As I mentioned at the start, COVID-19 has been a huge disruptor to global economies, including supply chains. We're, of course, an island nation, and we import the vast majority of our fuel security. Jim's done some exceptional work over the last couple of years on this question, and he's the subject matter expert here. Suffice to say, the government's taking steps in this direction, and on Monday it was announced that we're investing $200 million into building more storage for the oil reserve that we purchased earlier in the year from the US. I think we also need to review our supply chain. We need to work out what is absolutely essential to us and what we need to produce here in Australia. We need to work out what we don't want to source from countries that could potentially coerce us economically. And then we need to identify those things that we're happy to acquire through existing global supply chains. So these are some of the things that we need to do. And until they're done, it's really hard to chart a way forward. I'm obviously not a minister. I'm a backbencher who chairs the Intelligence and Security Committee. The Director General of ASIO several times over the past few years has said to us that espionage and foreign interference is being conducted at an unprecedented level in this country. So there is a real threat. When he says unprecedented, he means that we have unprecedented means that it exceeds that of the Cold War. So whilst we can't go into great detail about some of the things that are happening, nonetheless they are happening. So I might open up to questions there, Walter. But I will say, as much as I find journalists challenging and sometimes a pest, they are really, really important. And this is a final point I'll close with. Transparency is absolutely critical for democracies. One of the greatest things that we have going for us is transparency. If you want to expose some of this stuff, you need to have a culture of transparency. You need a free press to do that. You need good investigative journalists who are willing to go after the stories and expose these things. And we've seen a lot of that this past year from a number of different news platforms. But we also need transparency in the public square. Now, politicians, we have a register of interest that we need to continually update. That's reported on routinely. But we also now have a foreign influence transparency scheme, which is designed to ensure that the Australian public know that if someone's acting on behalf of a foreign government in the public square, then that is declared up front. And I think too much in the last decade, we've had people acting on behalf of foreign interests without actually declaring it. And so transparency, whether it be through government mechanisms like the Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme or through investigative journalists, must be upheld. And that's something that's really important. So Walter, I'll throw open the questions now.
Terrific, thank you, Andrew. We might start with a question from Natasha Maclaren-Jones, please.
Thank you very much, Walter, but also to Andrew for your comments this evening. My question is around the future of Australia-China research collaboration. And we've seen recently that China has overtaken the United States as Australia's leading research partner, with the majority of reports now that the Australia-led scientific publications include more research from China than any other country. I'm interested to hear your views on how you see the future of Australia's China research collaboration.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Natasha, and something that we will be exploring through my committee. You might be aware that some weeks ago, there was a series of articles published in The Australian about the 1,000 Talents Plan, which went to collaboration with scientists, both here and in China. Look, yeah, we're going to look at that. I have until July next year to report on that. We're going to make sure that we bring transparency and accountability to the university sector. Every single Australian taxpayer dollar that goes to the university sector must be acquitted in the national interest, either through the development of young Australian minds who will then go on to serve our country as economic leaders, researchers, political leaders, military leaders, or what have you. And also that the intellectual property is not lost, but is also harvested here to our benefit. And what we've seen, I think, is that some of the intellectual property that has been, developed here in Australia has been lost to patents overseas, but particularly in China. And just to add a further point to that, we also want to make sure that campus culture is free, that academic expression and freedom of speech is allowed. And we've had too many examples recently whereby I think that freedom, that culture of freedom has been traduced. There's the story of Drew Pavlou in the University of Queensland. There's Elaine Pearson of Human Rights Watch, but also an adjunct professor at the University of New South Wales. She posted something in support of the Hong Kong protesters, and that was censored. Now, the University of New South Wales has issued an apology, but nonetheless, these are things that need looking at. And so, insofar as research, campus culture, all those things we'll take a good look at.
Great, thank you.
Okay, just to make sure that everyone understands how they can ask a question, if you could run your cursor down the bottom of your Zoom screen, and you'll see a participants icon, and click on that, and you'll find at the bottom of that little window on the in the left-hand corner, there's a little blue hand. So by clicking on that, that'll indicate that you'd like to ask a question. We'll now go to Dale Cohen, and over to you, Dale. Thank you.
Right, I think I'm unmuted. Thank you, Andrew, for tonight, and thank you, Natasha, Walter, and Fritz for organising it. I'm from the Newport branch, and I can see a couple of my members also on tonight. Thank you for coming, guys. We formed a motion which had a bunch of stuff you guys in the federal parliament are busy ticking off. So by the time it gets anywhere, you'll have covered most of it. One of the items that I'm quite concerned about is Australian citizens of Chinese descent here in Australia being surveilled and influenced, for want of a better way of, and harassed, frankly, by the Chinese government because China sees them as Chinese citizens regardless of the fact they're Australians. What sort of protections do we think we can implement for our citizens here from being harassed by a government that considers they're their citizens?
Great question, Dale, and thank you for it. Look, that's why we introduced the foreign interference legislation, which actually engages this question. It's an offence to coerce diaspora groups in this country on behalf of a foreign government. And I think the countering foreign interference and espionage, the task force would be looking very closely at these sorts of things. It's a big, as I understand it, it's a big challenge in the university space as well. We have a lot of international students. They come here for a liberal education in the Western tradition. And as we've seen, there's what appears to be a culture of censorship around some of these geopolitical questions. And we've seen demonstrations and whatnot, particularly up in UQ. So this is being looked at. It is an offence. So the legislative framework is in place and our operational elements would be looking closely at this scale. But certainly stay tuned for some of the work that we will do over the coming months. And you'll be well served by people like Julian Lisa, the member for Barara, who's got an intimate understanding of the university sector. He's on the committee. Unfortunately, we lost Jim when he stepped out of the parliament for a brief time and then came back again. But other people like Senator Amanda Stoker, Erica Betts, and Tim Wilson, all on the coalition side, will be looking at this problem very closely.
Thank you, Andrew. We have some questions coming through in writing. Ashley McPhee asks whether you think we should have nuclear submarines and cancel the current subcontract.
It's a good question. Look, my view is we should be a nuclear country. We should have nuclear power. If we care about the planet, honestly, we care about the planet honestly, and we're not just committed to certain renewable interests, we would actually, we'd see the left commit to nuclear power because, of course, it has a very low CO2 footprint. Moreover, it can generate baseload power, which would really assist our manufacturing industry to take off, because power prices is one of the things that is keeping our manufacturing sector back. So I think if we have nuclear power servicing our domestic economy, the question then becomes, do we also have nuclear subs? And of course, if that were the case, yes, we have nuclear subs. I don't know where our sub program is. I can't give you some sort of inside track except to say that what I know is what you know, and that's the official position of the government. I think, you know, our geopolitics should shape our defence purchases, and by that I mean if you have a close relationship with, you know, the United States, as we do, then we should leverage that relationship. We should purchase tested equipment, and I'll give you a classic example. So in Afghanistan, I flew every single mission with US pilots. Every time we went outside the wire, it was on US Black Hawks or US Chinooks. And we always had a pair of Apache gunships in support. Never once did we have a pair of Australian Tiger helicopters in support. Airbus make the Tiger. The Tiger, I recall back in 2007, was due to be delivered around that year, and it's never once been operationally ready. So we went through the whole Afghanistan conflict without ever once having Australian air cover because our helicopters were just not ready for deployment. Now the Dutch gave us air cover. Why? Because they bought US Apache helicopters. And so my point is, the platforms you decide to buy at a strategic level really do shape your operational and tactical freedom. And if you buy a dud, then you pay for it. And I know personally that, you know, some of the instances on the ground might have played out differently in my own case if we'd had Australian pilots overhead with an established relationship and a level of familiarity with each other. So back to the subs. Look, I don't know enough information to comment. You know what my instincts are based on what I've just said, and I think I'll leave it at that, Walter.
Thank you, Andrew. You've made Fritz Maré's night. He was a jet fighter pilot with the Dutch Air Force, so he can go home now satisfied.
Yeah. Well, I did quite a few patrols with the Dutch. One thing that I can never work out is why they needed to have herring on a Sunday morning in Afghanistan in the mess. I could never work that out.
That's a little bit off topic. We might have to pick that up at a future event. I've got a question from Bob Partington, and it relates to power generation, which is surely critical. The infrastructure, reliable power generations are given. Renewables are neither. When will PM Morrison make a stand on this and exit Paris? A bit of a leading question.
Yeah, I'll park the Paris question to one side. I think his announcement yesterday about assisting New South Wales with gas, if no one comes to market, is a pretty good indicator of where the Prime Minister's at. I think, I think we're headed in the right direction. WA, for example, if you look at our energy grid, we're independent of the national energy market, right? So we operate on our own, the Southwest Interconnected System. We have a lot of wind over here, we have a lot of sun, but if you look at our energy mix over a 48-hour period or a 12-hour period, you'll see it's about 50% gas, 40% coal, and a mix of 10% wind and solar. And there's a reason why my electorate has 2 Alcoa refineries. We have Newmont Gold Mine. We have a lot of light, medium, and heavy industry here. And it's because we have reliable power and it's relatively cheap. So I think gas is the future. The challenge will be for state governments to get on board. We've seen that with Victorians, you know, being very slow to move on allowing for gas exploration. I think that's the secret for the East Coast. I've never been a fan of Paris. people should know my position. I opposed the neg when it came in, but in the end, I said it was a toothless tiger. There's no actual mechanism in the Paris Treaty to punish a country for not hitting its targets. We've just got to do what we need to do to look after Australian interests. I understand people are pretty passionate about the symbolism of exiting Paris, but you know, we're in a different world now, and we just need to focus on looking after Australian interests.
Thank you, Andrew. Question from Sasha Grebe, who has declared his candidacy for Warringah.
Hi, Andrew. How's it going?
Good, Sasha. How are you?
Yeah, pretty good, mate. You mentioned earlier, you know, China's debt diplomacy, particularly in the Pacific. And in July last year, the government launched the $2 billion Australian infrastructure financing facility for the Pacific. Now, a year later, we still haven't actually appointed the services panel, which is disappointing. And hopefully, you know, Australian companies get the bulk, if not all, the work. But like the defence strategy update, does this fund now need a bit of updating? And I'm thinking, you know, does it need to be more explicit about countering China? Is it too consultative with some of these countries? And can it align more with our defence activities in the region too? And I'm thinking about, you know, got a port built by the Chinese, you've got Australian patrol boats going in, who's operating the port? And, you know, should we be a little more explicit about our expectations of our neighbours?
I'm just getting a bit of feedback here. You just make sure everyone's, there we go. That's good. Thanks, Walter. Yeah, Sasha, that's a great question. I'll be frank with you. I don't know the particulars of that. Suffice to say, it sounds about right. We should be potentially doing more, leaning forward into it. On the part about being more explicit with regards to China, I think the PM's struck the balance well. I don't think we need to be necessarily provocative or inflammatory. We deal with each issue as it comes on a very factual basis. Engaging in sort of big statements is, I think, risky, which is why I think the defence strategic update was so good. It's a tough, realistic document without being too explosive. I thought the PM speech there was also very good. It was, again, tough-minded and realist. So as for that, I just don't have that level of insight being a backbencher, Sasha. So whilst that sounds like a cop-out, I don't know enough to make a comment, except to say I think, yeah, we should always be looking after the Southwest Pacific. It's a critical part of our security. It's mutual. We provide great security to them, economic assistance, and vice versa. And if you look at you know, strategic history of the Pacific, particularly World War II, the island chains around us are indeed very, very critical. And it's important that we maintain a strong sphere of influence through there.
Okay. We have a question now from Jacqueline. Thank you, Jacqueline. Just bear with me. We seem to be having a little bit of a technical issue. We might just have to leave, Jacqueline, and come back to you, Jacqueline. We'll see if we can just get this to work. So we have a question now from Philip Argy. No, I'm having difficulty. Sean, can you see if you can override and allow Mr. Argy to come in? There we go.
Thanks, Walter. Look, that's been really, really insightful, Andrew. Thank you for your talk. Can I just go back to something you said quite early in your comments about this, the different way they think in terms of Marxist-Leninist theory. And I'm just wondering whether we should be applying a different filter to the way we view what China does. Should we read it as provocatively as we do, or should we read it as simply a kind of relentless pursuit of a methodical strategy that's neither benign nor malignant? It's just the way they operate. And should that dictate a different approach? I mean, in terms of impact on us, it's plainly very severe, but it seems almost sometimes childish, and rather than malevolent. And I don't, you often wonder how you should react. Things like refusing to answer the phone when we want to speak to them, or reacting in childish ways. Are we just misreading it? Is there something we're missing, or is it really malevolent and we should take it much more seriously? And not appease them as we thought we would not do after early events in Germany in the last century. It's hard to know how to get this right.
All right, we might just go to Andrew here.
Yeah.
Thank you, Philip.
Yeah, I do think, Philip, we need to better understand our partners, our adversaries, and it is important that we understand the differences in culture, the way we come to strategic problems. A really helpful paper, which I would recommend to everyone here, and I can get this to you, Walter, to distribute, is Engineers of the Soul by John Garneau. Trump's national security advisor gave a speech probably about 5 or 6 weeks ago where he explicitly referenced this document. John gave me this document 2 or 3 years ago, and that was very helpful for me to understand Xi, the way he's consolidated his power, some of the sources of influence, both family and ideological, upon him and his worldview, and the connection between Stalinism and the CCP's ideology. And once you get that, it just helps you to understand things. I think for Australia, we're a regional power, we're a middle power, I suppose. We're 25 million people, vast continent, resource rich, a trading nation. We've always been a trading nation. 1 in 3 export dollars go to China. 1.9 billion Chinese are to our north. Geography, my belief is geography is destiny. And, we've got to learn to live in this region with everyone. The last thing we need is conflict. Conflict destroys prosperity. So it's a really tough thing. And so what it comes back to me is political leadership. We need really good political leadership. And Graham Allison's book, The Thucydides Trap, which went into reprint last year, I wrote the foreword for, is his ultimate conclusion is we need great statecraft and great political leadership, people who can make great judgments about these things. And so I come back to, the PM's approach, which is sort of understated, principled, standing up for our values, our interests and our sovereignty without being provocative, and continuing on with our economic relationships, but doing so from always a position of strength.
Thank you, Andrew. We'll now go to Alistair Thompson, please.
Thank you. Andrew, my question is about defence matters, really, I guess. There's a number of other countries in our region who are in somewhat of a similar position to us in terms of size, and even not maybe necessarily as economic size, but the ones I think of are Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, and then we have other countries in the region that also have similar problems and interests with China, like, for example, Vietnam and India. I just wondered what comments you have on how we should address our interests, our defensive interests, by working with those countries.
Yeah, I think staying engaged in our region is absolutely critical. There were calls for us to withdraw from the World Health Organization. I opposed that. I think the PM articulated it very well. We need to pursue our interests through multilateral institutions and alliances, both formal and informal. We're not a superpower, so the way the US approaches these problems, they do so as a superpower. We need to be collaborative. We need to be a good neighbor. and we need to build goodwill with all our economic and security partners. So in answer to your question, yes, our alliances are more important than ever before, particularly with countries that have shared interests and have a common view of the unfolding strategic situation in the Indo-Pacific region. When I wrote this forward for Graham Allison in the Thucydides Trap, if you've actually read the Peloponnesian War, you'll know about the island of Melos, which is a tiny island. And the Malians had to choose between the Spartans and the Athenians. They didn't want to choose, but they were forced to. And the Malians were invaded by the Athenians and rolled. And you know, it's a pretty disturbing bit of history when you read what happened to all the men and whatnot. My point being is we're a bit like Melos. You know, we need to have Athens and Sparta working together, which is a shorthand way of saying we need China and the US to get along. And that's why we sort of have a really important role in the region as a broker of sorts. And that comes back again to the quality of our political leadership, which is why it's good we've got the PM at the helm at the moment.
Okay, now we'll go to Tim James. Thank you. Facing the same little technical challenge.
Can you hear me now?
We can. Thank you, Tim.
Oh, thanks very much. Evening, Andrew. Welcome. Great to see you. Thanks to Walter, Fritz and Natasha for organising. I should just acknowledge also Tanya Davies, MP, who's a great Liberal and a great state member, I happen to notice is with us as well. So welcome to Tanya. And Andrew, thanks for your great courage and leadership. You have stood up strongly and clearly on China well before it was popular to do so. And we really appreciate that, I'm sure. I wanted to ask you a question about defence and how we make defence matter, if you like, and to make it more real and practical for all Australians in an everyday sense. And Menzies said, of course, to our country many decades ago that defence is a task for all of us. And I think that was well understood at the time, given the historical context, but I'm not so sure that it is as much today. And I wanted to ask you, how can we, as Liberals, how can the government, how can, you know, the party work to ensure that we do indeed see all Australians feeling concerned and responsible and able to do something in their own lives to serve the defence of our country? Sure.
I think there's a really great opportunity here for young Australians. I think one of the problems that we've seen here in the US is sort of a divide between civil society and our defence members. We used to have a lot more defence assets in Sydney and Victoria, but during the 80s, when we started defending the air-sea gap to the north, we concentrated a lot of our defence assets up through Northern Queensland and the Northern Territory. And so for a lot of young Australians, when they join defence, they leave their homes in the southeast corner of the country and then end up in places like Perth, which is kind of my story. I went Sydney, then to Canberra, then up to Darwin for 3 years, and then I've settled in Perth. So my family's all over east. My parents are trapped in Melbourne, locked down. So one of the challenges is, of course, you know, that disconnect between defence and civil society. And what I think, and, you know, I'm sure there's going to be announcements in the budget, which I'm not briefed in, but I'm sure there'll be stuff around defence. But one of the things I have been thinking about is some form of incentivised national service. Now, when I say national service, I don't mean conscription, but we have a gap here at the moment. And young Australians can join the ADF, whether it be Army, Navy or Air Force, for 1 year. And it's an opportunity to learn some basic soldiering skills, have some work experience, as it were. But I don't think it really ticks the box. I think 2 years is kind of minimum, which is what it used to be when we did have national service. You can generate a level of competence in a rifleman or an airman or a sailor over a 2 year period. And I think it's a time of growth for young Australians, 18 to 20 years old. we all remember what that was like. You're not sure really where you're going to end up. And having 2 years in defence to do something that challenges you, learn leadership, take risks, I think is really important. Also, Federation is under a lot of pressure at the moment, particularly out in WA. We're hearing some very strong sort of Western Australian perspectives. Some people are even calling for succession, which I reject. I'm a big believer in Australia. So, but then the dividend would be also to have a deeper and wider catchment of reserve members across the ADF. You'd see more people in civil society who have an experience and a familiarity with defence. You could build a cyber capability, because of course the private sector refreshes tech faster than government. That's just true, I think, around the world. So that would be my approach to the challenge, which kind of takes defence away from just, a conversation that we have around Anzac Day and Remembrance Day, to you, Tim, having a child who, has done 2 years, and then comes back and, lives an active life in the reserves for 10 or 15 years afterwards. So everyone benefits. And maybe as a way of incentivising that 2 years national service, we give a subsidy to HEX or trade skill training once they've done that 2 years service. And, that upholds the liberal tradition of mutual obligation, which is really important.
Thanks, Andrew. Well said.
We have a question from Tanya Davies now, who's having some technical difficulty at her end. Natasha, do you have a copy of Tanya's question?
I do. So Tanya was interested in getting a bit more information on your understanding and also the work of your committee in identifying Chinese influence and also the degree of their influence in our elections, and what can we do to combat it?
Sure. Really good question. My committee is a statutory committee, which means our responsibilities are outlined in legislation, the Intelligence Services Act. We do administrative and financial oversight of the intelligence agencies. We also get briefed on themes relating to the threat environment. We list terrorist organisations and the like. And we also serve as a review body for national security legislation. Rather than having our debates in public where our adversaries could watch on, we have them behind closed doors, sometimes in classified environments. And so that's really the purpose of the committee. As for making statements about the level of influence, whether it be from Chinese actors through to Russians to anyone else, terrorism, for example, we leave that up to the Director General of ASIO, Mike Burgess, very competent guy, really, really sound. And so he does a threat update. He did one at the start of the year. And I encourage people to go and have a read of it, because it really does set the contours for understanding the threats that we are facing as a country.
Okay, now we'll go to Paul Nettlebeck.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Andrew. I think most of us haven't seen you since the Roseville Golf Club, which was a great night with you and Dave Sharma. Thanks so much for that.
Pleasure.
My question is in relation to the Port of Darwin and is also following on from the theme of tearing up the contract. You mentioned the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, and what's happened with the threat with the port in Sri Lanka. Has the possibility of repatriating the Port of Darwin been discussed in your committee? Is there a chance to buy it back, at least take control, or at least take control of 51%, given the process and the distraction of Prime Minister changes at the time that it went through?
Sure. Yeah, again, another great question and a tough one, because, there is a contract in place. We do have the rule of law, and before you revoke any of these things, you also want to have good cause, and you also need to consider the strategic environment. I've said publicly that I was quite upset about the sale of the Port of Darwin. the way it managed to slip through some of our key agencies. You know, I've also been disappointed to see that it's actually been listed as part of the BRI. It's not, but you know, it has been listed as part of the BRI. The question is, if you are going to do something like that, and I've said that it should always be an option, you should always have those options on the table. You need to consider the strategic environment, whether such an act would be provocative, what's the purpose of it, does it serve an immediate objective? Of course, it is critical infrastructure, and those sorts of things, I believe, should be in sovereign hands. But you know, the timing, the circumstances, the reason, the way it's done would all be a question for the government and those people who have the right information. So it sounds like I'm hedging, but like anything, these are tough decisions, and you need to make shrewd judgments about when to do them. Moreover, you know, there's a lot of other things that are going on at the moment as well. And although the Port of Darwin is emblematic, and people like Albo have suddenly discovered the Port of Darwin and sort of have been making noises about it, he's Johnny come lately. We've done a lot since the Port of Darwin sale. And one of the really important things that we've done is introduce the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act, which basically monitors critical assets like ports, water assets, poles and wires that have a level of ownership in them. And we track it for espionage, sabotage, and other disruptive measures. And the Port of Darwin would certainly be on that central register. Moreover, we've beefed up FIRB. David Irvine, the former head of ASIO and ASIS, sits on the FIRB board. You would have seen this year as well, the way we you know, change some of the rules around FIRB to protect distressed Australian assets. And of course, we now have a divestment power if the FIRB has grounds on national security reasons to divest foreign ownership of a critical asset. So that's a lot of context, but these are some of the things to think about. And I'm sure Labor will try and wedge us on this, but we've got to be thoughtful about the way we approach problems like the Port of Darwin.
Question from Michael Verblut, a written question about digital sovereignty. With the discussion of two global internet systems, Chinese and other, how do you feel this will impact Australia's future trade, political relations, and overall function in the region?
It's going to be increasingly more challenging. I think what we're starting to see is two rival internets, both virtual and physical. You know, of course, a lot of the big tech platforms come out of Silicon Valley in the United States, Facebook, Twitter, and the like. But China's also got a very dynamic tech space as well. There's a race to develop artificial intelligence. And of course, to do all these things, you need strong physical networks, and you need strong virtual networks. And at the moment, there's a big firewall in China which separates the Chinese people and the way they operate their systems from the rest of the world. So I'm pretty confident you still can't access things like Facebook and Twitter in a meaningful sense in China the way you can here. And that being the case, you could say there's already a bit of a wall between us and you know, 1.9 billion Chinese. Does this get worse over time? A lot hinges on what happens the next 50 days with the US presidential election. Like, this comes back to what I said at the start. Every single geopolitical problem in the decade ahead will be refracted through the competition of the United States and the PRC. And that's why we've got to be on our toes and constantly adapting.
Very good. And it's good to see our younger generation represented this evening. And we have a question from Bo Zhong.
Hi, Andrew. Thank you so much for sharing all your expertise. Really enjoying it. I was wondering about the topic of academic freedom, which you are very publicly expressive of, and which I thank you for doing on behalf of many young Australians. And I was wondering, how best do you think is it for, I mean, how should we as young Australians approach this issue in a generation that's increasingly cautious to express views and opinions, especially on a university campus?
I think a great metaphor is the freedom of navigation operations that a number of different navies have done through the South China Sea. Keeping laws of the sea upheld, sailing through those waters is really, really important. And I think that university students in Australia need to be conducting FONOPs of their own on campus, being prepared to take a risk and speak your mind, being active in student politics, even if your worldview is the minority, and I suspect those of a centre-right persuasion increasingly are, being prepared to be the controversial voice in tutorials. All of those things constitute a personal freedom of navigation exercise. And the more Australians doing that, whether it be at university or in the workplace, not in a provocative sense, but just not shrinking away from your convictions, I think that's really important, because I think a lot of us are in a defensive crouch at the moment. You know, politicians, we get paid to cop a fair bit of incoming and abuse. That's just part of the job. But there's a lot of Australians out there who just want to live their lives and express their views without being persecuted for it. But right now, I think there's a bit of fear about that, and you know, courage is contagious, whether it be on the battlefield, in the House, in Parliament, you know, at the university campus. So we just need young Australians, particularly, showing courage and speaking their mind and demonstrating that freedom of expression, which makes us unique as a country.
Thank you. We now have a question from Marilyn Smith.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can, Marilyn.
Oh, good, thank you. I wanted to raise the question of the reduction in diplomatic staff that's been announced in the last few months. Some more were announced just recently, some more reductions. And it seems counterintuitive to me that in the current climate that we've been talking about, that we seem to be reducing our diplomatic abilities. And I just wonder if you have any ideas or comments on that.
That's yeah, Marilyn, it's not an area I'm completely familiar with. I wish I had my wingman from Roseville, Dave Sharma, here, who's formerly DFAT, and would be able to answer that question with a bit more accuracy. I don't know, to be honest. Sure, diplomats are a critical part of our foreign influence, our positive foreign influence, our soft power, if you want to call it that. And, you know, we need to be engaged. I'd expect as, you know, the world becomes more uncertain that we would need more people, but I'm just not intimate with the decision-making process or the budgets.
Thank you.
I think we do need more. I think we need I'd like to see our defence grow, for sure. And if you're growing defence, there's probably a case to be made for your diplomatic corps as well.
I just was thinking that we need the eyes and ears on the ground.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I've got a written question from Nigel, and it is, it's a well-known fact that at some point in the next 20 years, China's economy will be larger than the US. What do you think are the implications of this for Australia for the balance of this century? Do you think George Friedman's book suggesting that China may fragment is a real option?
Again, I don't have a crystal ball. I wish I did. It'd make my job a lot easier, that's for sure. But yeah, look, I think there are a lot of demographic challenges facing China. Their population is aging. They also have, you know, a very imbalanced population which is the fruit of the one-child policy. They are growing. but who's to say things won't change? I just don't know. They have a lot of problems. They have political problems with Hong Kong, with Taiwan. They have what you might call ethnographic challenges with in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs and elsewhere. So China has a lot of challenges on its doorstep, notwithstanding its economic growth. So yeah, I'm very wary of making predictions, except to say we need to stay engaged with China. We need to keep open lines of communication with China, and we need to continue to work with the US and China to keep our region stable.
A written question from Simon Hutchinson. At what point does Australia, in your opinion, commence the build out of a genuine offensive forward deterrent military capability through each arm of the armed forces? Separately, but related, what are your and the government's views on further embedding our military coalition with the US through the establishment of significant shared bases on Australian soil, mirroring similar arrangements as exist in Western Europe, Japan, and other Asian states?
That's yeah. Let me take the second part first. Are we going to have US bases on Australian sovereign soil? We already have the Joint Defence Facility in Alice Springs, Pine Gap, which has been around for some time. It's a critical part of our defence relationship, strategic relationship with the United States. We have the Marine Expeditionary Force up north, which is, again, a big capability. I think we've got 2,000 rotating at any one time. And of course, you know, we have an ongoing link across our services with the United States. I like to quote Kim Beazley, who a couple of years ago said, if you want to understand the depth of our relationship with the United States, go granular, look down at the tactical elements, and everywhere across Navy, Army, Air Force, our law enforcement, our intelligence operations, we have US embedded with us, and we have Australians embedded with the United States. I think in Hawaii, in Indo-Pacific Command, I think one of the deputy commanders is an Australian general, which is huge. That's a very important step. So 50% of the United States military assets are in the Indo-Pacific region. The Indo-Pacific region for them starts from you know, the west coast of the United States and sort of finishes around Pakistan. So 50% of the US military capability is concentrated in our region. You know, we're already very close. I'd have to see an argument for further basing, but I think we've got the balance right at the moment. I'm trying to remember the first part of the question. Sorry, Walter.
The first part of the question was, bear with me. Okay, I've just sort of jumped ahead. Just bear with me. That's a good question, Andrew. Here we go. At what point does Australia, in your opinion, commence the build out of a genuine offensive forward deterrent military capability?
Look, I think we're already pivoting. That's why I encourage you to read the Defence Strategic Update. The way I like to think about defence, particularly for Australia, we want to be that, you know, friendly bloke in a pub who smiles and gets on with everyone else, but you sure as heck don't want to pick a fight with, because, you know, we can throw a punch, and you want people assessing the risk of taking you on, and you know, the way we do that, I think, you know, that's underway, but that's the kind of posture we want to have. Friendly with everyone, but don't pick a fight with us. And I think that's why missile defence is an important part of the strategic plan going forward.
Question from Councillor Trenton Brown.
Thank you very much, Walter, and thank you, Andrew, for joining us tonight. My question is related to the university sector as an export industry, because a lot of what has come to pass is that there are a lot of tertiary sector young kids being educated here, and we like to think of it as a Western ideal to, you know, receive a university liberal education in a Western nation. Yet many of these students are the very agents of coercive power within our country, represented in our local, state and federal elections. And and their engagement with political candidates eventually leads to sort of elite capture, if you like, development of relationships, influence of electoral outcomes. I wonder what you think of that statement and what experience you have, and importantly, you know, given the COVID-19 environment, is there an opportunity to recalibrate the heavy percentage of overseas students that especially come from China?
I think the first thing is, yes, we are very trade exposed in the university sector. I know Curtin University, Murdoch University out west here are in a really tough time at the moment with none of the students coming through. Places like ECU, Edith Cowan University, less so. They've got a more diverse makeup of international students. But nonetheless, there are significant risks, economic, but also particularly if you transition the university from a sovereign institution where you develop young Australians and do really important research to a business model where you're selling degrees into the region, something gets lost in that process. And I think this is something that we need to look at. We really need to revisit the university sector. Now we're coming at it through a foreign interference lens, but what we really want to see is just greater transparency and accountability in the university sector. We don't want to securitize the university sector. We certainly don't want to have ASIO running around campuses. That's not their job. Their job is to deal with, you know, the most pressing threats to our country. But if universities actually did their jobs, they upheld academic freedom, freedom of expression. Their research collaboration was above board. They deconflicted their conflicts of interest. If they made it clear, you know, who was collaborating with whom and for how long, and where patents were ending up and what intellectual property, you know, was compromised, then we wouldn't have a lot of the problems that we have. So it's really on the university sector to demonstrate that they're serious about protecting our sovereign interests. And I think that's where the challenge lies.
We've got so many more questions, but in being respectful for Andrew's time, we might do two more. One with the questioner being John White, and then I may finish with a written question. Over to you, John.
Andrew, I wanted to build on your mention of supply chains, which has become so obvious out of COVID, but also your previous interest in having Strategic Industries Act. I think we all need to remember that one of the reasons the Japanese were beaten in the Pacific was that the Australian governments in the 1930s mobilised Australian industry, and we were able to support the Americans and the Australian military in resisting the Japanese. We need to do the same in this decade because our strategic situation is getting worse. We have $200 billion of defence procurement, $100 billion on submarines and frigates and OPVs. We had a terrific 2016 Australian defence industry policy. It is not being adhered to. The overseas prime contractors have been let off the hook in terms of building Australian companies into the supply chains. We're buying frigates and submarines for 3 to 4 times the price that any other first world country would. That in itself is ridiculous. But we are going to have almost no Australian content in any of these vessels in the supply chains. Now, it's not too late. They're cost reimbursable contracts. The government can instruct them to engineer thousands of Australian companies into the supply chains. I ran the Anzac frigates. I know it can be done. We just have to do it, Andrew. And frankly, there's thousands of Australian companies, over 50,000 employees just waiting for the government to wake up to what the overseas primes are doing. We need a champion in Canberra who can understand this. And I want to ask are you potentially that champion? We can explain the situation, but we need a voice in Canberra.
Okay, my written question comes from Daniel. Oh, sorry.
I just want to say thanks to John. Look, yeah, I'm all about Australian sovereignty, which includes sovereign industry. I'd love to see our manufacturing sector regrown through our defence contracts. Greg Sheridan made a great argument some months ago when he said, you know, the wonderful thing about having a manufacturing sector is that a lot of the training for people is done, you know, in-house. You don't need as many TAFEs when you've got a culture, a live ecosystem of, you know, apprentices learning on the job and moving up through businesses, and it's a really important thing, and we've lost a lot of that. So, would I love to champion it? Yes, I would. As you know, we've all got a bucket, and most politicians' buckets are already overflowing. So, keen to learn more about it.
Great, thank you.
Fritz Murray's just asked if you can ask a quick question. Over to you quickly, Fritz.
Fritz, you'll have to unmute.
There you go. That's better. Andrew, just a quick question here. China is reshaping the international rules by using its growing influence to better serve its own purposes. It's also been developing extensive military capabilities near Taiwan and in the South China Sea. They've always seen Taiwan, I guess, as a recalcitrant province that they want to bring back. Now, the result of that is that the West is starting to see China as an increasing security threat. It creates distrust and it's creating tension. So my question to you is quite simply, do you see this as a possibility that it may result in military conflicts?
I think the odds of strategic miscalculation are far greater now.
Okay.
I think that there is a real risk there, particularly with India and China. Mm-hmm. And you know, one thing this COVID-19 has done has reinforced the trust deficit that the PRC now has internationally. Mm-hmm. You know, the South China Sea eroded a lot of trust in bilateral relations with China across the world. But the way the COVID-19 pandemic was handled back in January, when the way it was allowed to be exported to the rest of the world, when internal travel within China was shut down, has just, you know, further diminished that trust. And so I think strategic miscalculation, therefore, the risk goes up. And you know, history. I'm a student of history. History shows us that you know, military conflict is part of the human experience, and that's why the challenge, once again, for political leaders is to find a way out that preserves the peace. And now is the time for great leaders.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And at this point, I will go to Natasha Maclaren-Jones for the vote of thanks. Thank you.
Thank you. And Andrew, on behalf of the co-hosts for the forum, Walter and Fritz, I want to thank you this evening for a very informative address. For quite some time, you've been working to raise awareness of both the dominance of China and the aggression in the region, particularly the unlawful claims in the South China Seas. Over the past few months, our nation has grappled with both the health and economic crisis. We've been forced to face the reality that Australia must become more economically independent. We need to move our ability to provide for ourselves so we don't depend on others for vital supplies like fuel, food, equipment, and natural resources. Furthermore, this period has allowed Australians to see what has been slowly evolving over decades, and that's been the rising influence of China. This evening, Andrew, you revealed the inconvenient truth about Australia and China. We continue to try and understand their actions and anticipate their moves based on Western values, and we ignore the role that ideology plays in China's actions, their Marxist-Leninist ideology. Only this week, the extent of China's monitoring on non-Chinese people has been revealed. Their secret overseas key individual databases track not only politicians and academics, but everyday people with no connection to China. Furthermore, for decades, China has been tackling tracing and taking our intellectual property from Western businesses and universities and building up a wealth of knowledge on our data. As Andrew eloquently outlined this evening, we must take action. Australia must hold on to our sovereignty, our prosperity and our security. We must diversify our trading partners, be less reliant on China, and ensure Australia is in a strong position to guarantee our ability to manufacture essential goods. Furthermore, no matter what the future holds, Australia must be able to defend our national security. We cannot forget Australia has a vital role to play. By ensuring our own sovereignty, we are in the best position to help other countries do the same. And as Andrew said, this year will be remembered as a year of disruption. And the next decade will be one of the most challenging for Australia that we've ever faced. As we work to safeguard our future, and it's wonderful to have you in Canberra, not only as a member of the Liberal team, but as the Morrison government. Again, thank you very much for your insights this evening.
Thank you, Natasha and Andrew. It's been a terrific event and the positive feedback's already starting to come through, which is great. And we look forward to seeing everybody for our next event in November. And we have another terrific speaker. So thanks everybody for participating and have a great evening.
And thanks, Walter. If I may, I just want to say to the Northern Forum, I look forward to your campaign to dislodge the current member for Warringah, who is low impact, and we need a strong Liberal voice in your neck of the woods who will advocate for the things that we matter. So I really encourage you to start campaigning and let's take that seat back.
Don't worry, Andrew, that's coming.
Thank you.
Thanks.